We have a fantastic returning guest, Shaun Abrahamson.
We used to say, if you couldn't get through Series A, then Plan B is break even.
This episode specifically is packed with very forward-looking type of insights, all centered around this concept that Shaun and his team are building called speed strapping.
We have a bunch of teams that did sort of 0 to $1 million plus in revenue, all hardware, all things that could have taken much longer and much more capital.
It's this focus on helping hardware companies, especially in CleanTech.
And so your data set, if you're talking to folks who are not clearly in AI, life is rough. Right? I mean, it's sort of about the hardest I can remember. For first version, we can probably do most of what we wanted to do if we use the existing Legos instead of making new Lego. The mega funds are trying to anoint winners by investing in such large sums that they're essentially scare away competitors.
Hey everyone, Happy New Year. Welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast. It's your boy, Silas Maynor, your favorite CleanTech headhunter. Who else would it be? I'm really excited to bring this first episode to you guys this year. We have a fantastic returning guest, Shaun Abrahamson. If you're not familiar, Shaun is an absolute legend. He's one of the partners at the Third Sphere VC firm. And he's just got so many incredible insights. Every time I talk to Shaun, I find myself just wanting to keep talking to him and learning more because he's just got so much interesting things that he has to say. He thinks deeply about these things. So we have him on to have a really good kickoff episode for this year. As an FYI, the past episodes with Shaun are also extremely good. You can check them out, episode 136, 176, and 220. I would recommend going and listening to those. But this episode specifically is packed with very forward-looking type of insights, all centered around this concept that Shaun and his team are building called speed strapping. And you might ask, what the heck is speed strapping? Well, we'll tell you today. But in general, it's this focus on helping hardware companies, especially in CleanTech, get to a point where they are at the scale they need to raise more money or to just be a profitable hardware company. He's got some very interesting insights because of the types of companies that they have invested in and worked with. He has some unique insights, I would say. On top of that, we also talk about this whole branding issue that's going on with 2026, given the pushback in CleanTech, climate tech, like what are we calling it? Because depending on what you're working on, you might want to brand yourself as reindustrialization, national security. There's different things. So we talk about that. Shaun has a very unique perspective on that as well. And as part of that discussion, we talk about his perspective on climate founders who are working at the intersection of national security, defense, and climate. Some of those things sometimes get jumbled up and they feel a little bit in opposition at times, but we have some good discussion there. So before we start, a quick shout out to the sponsors who make this show possible. First, we have Climate Finance Solutions, my guy Joel. Your first call whenever you're looking to apply for grant funding. They help clean tech startups raise money from grants, and they've done it very successfully. First, we have Climate Finance Solutions, what should be your absolute first call whenever you are looking to apply and raise grant funding. They have helped clean tech startups raise over $1.6 billion since 2020 and have a 90% success rate winning the funds that they apply for. So reach out to Joel and his team. You can find the link to do so in the description. They are absolutely killer. Secondly, my company, EarthSearch. We are a full-service recruitment partner that works fully integrated with your team, with all clean tech companies, to help you find the best talent and to build a differentiated talent attraction system, a full system that will give you an unfair advantage over your competitors. You can reach out to learn how. And heads up, we are running a January promotion. So if you want to learn how to get $5,000 off your first search with us, check out the show notes for how to do that, or keep listening for the ad read later on in the episode. But without any further delay, I'm extremely excited to offer you this episode, this first episode of the year with Shaun Abrahamson. All right. Welcome back to the pod, Shaun. How you doing today?
Pretty good. Good to be back.
Absolutely, man. If anybody's not familiar, Shaun has been on the pod. This is the fourth time, I think, right?
I think
it's the fourth time, which I think is the first time somebody's been on 4 times. So it's for good reason too. If anybody is not familiar with with Shaun, you should go listen to some of the past episodes. We'll reference them in the show notes. But we're having Shaun back on because we haven't caught up for a while. But we wanted to talk about a number of things. I'm not gonna, I guess, spoil the docket yet, so we'll just get straight into it. I'll start off with, I did miss your guys' event this past Climate Week in New York. So I'm just kind of curious what your guys' core observations and takeaways were, because usually you have a pretty good finger on the pulse as to what's going on in climate. I know this is now several months ago, but I'm just curious to see what you guys are thinking and talking about.
Appreciate that. I'm not sure we have a great pulse. I think part of this year was like there's a lot of stuff we don't understand. So it's leading us to sort of rethink fundraising strategies with our founders. That's probably the biggest takeaway. So we can go through, if you want, we can go through like the context for why that is, but the sort of high level take is we call it speed strapping. And it's basically, it's flipping. What used to happen at Series A is we used to say, if you couldn't get through Series A, then plan B is break even, right? And we have a bunch of companies who have been really successful after plan B. That is to say, they failed at Series A raise, but they've gone on to be very successful. And so the main thing that changed for us is we don't know what Series A metrics are anymore. So as a founder, for us to explain to founders what they should be aiming for is now much more complicated. But it is easier to explain, a path to break even. There's some things.
Does that have to start then from just day one of the company itself?
Yeah. So we're not always obviously at day one, but we close to the beginning. We certainly are like pre-seed. So if you can decide that at pre-seed, and generally the decision is time to revenue. That's the biggest decision, right? So, we went through the era of, really phenomenal ideas, but need to pass through a 50 or $100 million raise to build the thing, to make the thing, to get to revenue. And that's really just not compatible with speed trapping.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we sort of looked at a lot of those types of deals in past. We didn't have a good alternative suggestion a few years ago. I think more and more what we noticed is we would just push founders and say, why aren't you going more aggressively after revenue? Like how many more iterations of the product you want to do? Why are you making custom components when you could do off the shelf? Just questions. And I think the last 12 months in particular have been super impressive. Like we have a bunch of teams that did sort of 0 to $1 million plus in revenue, all hardware, all things that could have taken much longer and much more capital. So I think we're even surprised that it can actually work as well as it is working.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It's when the market is tougher, it just forces people to think a little differently about it, right? If there's free money and it's ZERP era, it's like why do I have to worry, right? But now it's like, well, we have to find a way to get the revenue in the door. Has it had to come from the VCs to convince them to do this, or were the founders already thinking about this?
So I think the founders, they think about it for different reasons, and that's maybe the context of what's changing. So one is roughly the number of funds from the sort of peak in 2021 is half, right? So it's like, okay, so you have friends who are succeeding at fundraising, but not as many. And then you can further segment that into friends doing AI or like some core AI, and then friends who are not. And so your data set, if you're talking to folks who are not clearly in AI, life is rough, right? I mean, it's sort of about the hardest I can remember. And so I think the folks that are still choosing to build in that environment, meaning sort of not clearly AI, are thinking that, by the time they're chatting with us, they've thought about this, and we're not suggesting anything outrageous. So yeah, I don't think they need a lot of convincing, because a lot of the environment is, if they've talked to a few other founders, they'll get a decent picture of like, there's two worlds. If you're outside of AI, you need a different plan.
Yeah. That does make a lot of sense. I spent a little bit more time this past year, kind of inadvertently, with non-climate founders, and it's definitely a different world. The two buckets analogy I think is quite good. But it's easier said than, like, you can say, hey, you got to find a way to a path to revenue faster. This idea of like, let's get to profitability, if you will, as fast as possible, rather than the typical VC route, just raise money and show traction and keep raising more money. But that's easier said than done. Like, what are the core things that are actually different for a hardware company? Can you explain maybe like the standard before or the standard now?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, so I guess going way back, my sort of favorite example is, early days of Apple. It took a while to get to equity. There was, some structured deal with a distributor who was like, I'll give you money to go and buy parts. The beginning of that story doesn't look like VC. Obviously, at some point there is VC. And I think that's kind of what's going on in the hardware world today. Is we took this idea, I think, mainly from software around customer discovery. which meant that in order to prove that there was interest and potentially people to buy your product, you would interview them and ask them questions. You wouldn't take the additional step of saying, well, if you really want this, put down a deposit. Or if you really want this, prepay me and I'll go and build it, right? So we had a window of like, Kickstarter and Indiegogo land. That's one version of it. But like, I think that's an interesting, for us in some ways, that became an interesting add to customer discovery, which also just happens to bring revenue on faster. And so the main thing I think is just pre-selling as part of the customer discovery process and actually getting cash in that process, right? And it sometimes you can't get all the way there. Sometimes it's an LOI, sometimes it's a fraction of the money that you need, but it does force different behavior.
This episode is brought to you by Climate Finance Solutions, the firm helping climate tech companies win the major government grants that drive their scale and impact. Since 2020, they've won over $1.6 billion in public funding for their clients, with a 90% success rate on the dollars that they've applied for. Their team has also helped win more than 500 million euros in European funding and managed over $275 million in grant projects. With a global team of 27 experts, CFS supports climate innovators through every stage of the funding lifecycle, from strategy to proposals to project execution. They also have a grant identification platform that enables real-time monitoring and custom matching of opportunities with alerts as new grants are released. If you're a climate investor, accelerator, or ecosystem builder, you can even join their partnership program to unlock pro bono support for your portfolio companies. Learn more at climatefinancesolutions.com. All right, back to the show.
Yeah. I think
But at least, why not at least ask for something, right? Like if you're not asking for any sort of commitment, then you're just completely missing an opportunity, right? At the bare minimum.
I think the commitment, I think we just, as far as I can tell, folks just weren't asking for commitment. They were asking really intelligent questions to build a data set of what to build in sort of the classic product development sort of role. I mean, it's what great product people do. Is you just go and figure out, you can have some assumptions, you go and talk to people, figure out, test the assumptions. But taking that extra step of saying, I think I actually figured out that this is a real pain point for you, and testing the willingness to pay by actually asking people to pay,
Yeah.
it seems kind of silly, but actually it's useful. And I think the sort of counterfactual maybe is that if folks sort of hesitate at that point, then you should ask yourself why. Maybe it isn't such a pain point. Or maybe they're not.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because it would that whole point. I remember when I read that book the first time, the mom test, right? The core principle was make sure you set up a website where they actually like input their payment details, and you can say, oh, we're not accepting payment details, but they went to that step, and you know that there was the intent, and then you can go build it if people actually have an interest in it, right?
Yeah.
I think it's the same thing true here. You mentioned also that some people this idea of doing off the shelf versus custom parts. Is that a big component as well, where they're just trying to retrofit existing hardware and just patch it together to make it work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense that really interesting things or really new things require new components. In other words, to get if you go back and look at Tesla or Nvidia, like the number of new things is I think in many cases surprising. So in the case of Tesla, you could ship a first car by just focusing on the battery, which is a little bit counterintuitive given how many other parts of the car there are, right? But you have to make a choice to say, I'm going to bring along a bunch of people who can actually do most of the work, that sell most of the components. And I think the running joke, I went to a demo and I was like, we're looking around at the sort of major components. I'm like, does it have a ID number on the part? Because if it does, then it's probably out of an off-the-shelf part. If it doesn't, it's probably custom. And I think that our main lesson is you can build most things by repurposing existing things and integrating them differently. And a lot of the time, the magic is probably from the firmware, or the magic is the sort of system level design versus the individual components. And so, yeah, I mean, we keep pushing on that. We're going to be wrong for some percent of companies, but it feels like a relatively small percent. In most cases, if you push, especially good engineers and product folks on, do you really need this thing to be this way for your first version? The answer usually is actually no. Like there's some things we can't do, but for a first version, we can probably do most of what we wanted to do if we use the existing Legos instead of making new Lego.
I love the Lego analogy by the way. But does this usually become then a qualifier for whether or not you'll invest in an early
For
company
sure,
because
for us,
they've already thought about this?
yeah, for us for sure. We have some qualifiers. One is sort of techno-economics, which is just trying to understand over time what we should. So if you think about the Lego analogy, which Lego pieces are getting cheaper over time, and why are they getting
Hmm.
cheaper? And the ideal answer is that yes, they are getting cheaper, and it's completely independent of the company. Like when the founders go to sleep every night, they will wake up in the morning and someone else worked on those things to make them cheaper, completely independent of the company, right? So again, in most cases, if you look at robotics, a lot of the robotics, is coming out of, phones are happening anyway. So the things that are
Hmm.
happening here, multiple sensors and cameras, like all these things are great for machine vision. There's absolutely nothing you need to think about as a founder. When you go to sleep, someone else is making those things better and faster and cheaper. So that's the one thing. And then the second thing is, yeah, can you go and get the parts? Ideally, you have a slide which is here's why things get cheaper, and then two, here are the logos from companies that you would recognize and we can buy these things from, so we don't have to worry about them.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing I could imagine some founders, and again, I'm not necessarily most qualified to speak to this, but I could imagine they would be concerned about the fact that, hey, where's the IP, right? Some VCs might ask them, well, where's the IP if you're using off-the-shelf hardware? What is your take on that, and why does that not really matter? Because if it did matter, you clearly wouldn't invest.
Yeah, so I think that there's a few layers of IP. There's one which is very often, I think, the thing that you're building for your first product is not the product, it's the capacity to make the product,
Mm,
right? So if you think about a trade secret, how you put things together, what the software controls are for those things, what the data collection is that you can use for training and characterizing the system, that whole stack is just as interesting as the component parts. So the answer should be in a lot of cases that if I took the thing apart, I would learn something, but not everything to reproduce the thing.
okay, got it. That
So
makes a lot of
so
sense.
yeah, so there's IP. It's probably a lot of the IP we would say lives outside of the physical thing. And
Mm,
then there's a few other hacks, like you can make things that you lease out, so you have a little bit more control because you have a fleet, and so there isn't really a customer that
I
ever,
see.
like famously when the first steam engines were made, you weren't supposed to touch them. Some service people would show up, they would literally put a curtain around the machine so you couldn't see what they were doing, and then they would appear at the end and be like, okay, it's fixed, you can get back to work. And so I think there's a lot of, I think, non-traditional IP from running a fleet where customers just don't need access. Actually, there's a lot of debates on sort of right to repair, but like this is an automotive thing that has been underway for a while.
Yeah,
Where like, I think there's a few new cars that have a hood latch that doesn't open anything except maybe like a filler cap for the oil and the gas. Like
yeah.
literally, actually opening the hood
My,
is a struggle.
yeah, my uncles are mechanics, and trust me, I've heard of this. They,
So
they,
yeah,
they have not moved into the electrical engineering side of being car mechanics yet, so they're struggling. They're working on the old beaters right now.
yeah, I mean,
uh,
it's really funny. There's definitely a cutoff. I mean, it is, yeah, it's interesting. There's a sort of I would say lockdown. It's probably 2000s,
yeah,
right? Like before
exactly.
that, you can still, there's stuff you can work around. Anyway,
Yeah, this is really helpful. I think this is a good, I guess, just for people to recognize that there is a paradigm shift, right? There's a way that you can just focus on being really scrappy and focusing on actually getting to revenue, doing things that are the least effort possible to iterate to get to the point where you are like making sure that you're meeting the demand, that there is really actually a demand for this, that you can save people money, hypothetically doing it in smaller sizes, but also thinking about like whether or not your business model is going to be just selling hardware, or are you going to manage equipment in like in a fleet of sorts. So that's helpful. You mentioned earlier, we didn't really touch on it too much yet, so let's go into it a little deeper, that you guys have this kind of what you're calling speed strapping, right? This idea of it's in response to a number of these trends. So can you just break down any of those trends that we didn't talk about that are causing people to do this thing called speed strapping, and then let's get into what exactly that looks like, writ large.
yeah. So I mean, I think probably the biggest trend is what I think has been described as like consensus investing, So fewer funds trying to do really a couple of things. If you're an early stage fund, you basically are trying to hand off to a mega fund, and the mega
Hmm.
funds are trying to anoint winners by
Okay.
investing in such large sums that they're essentially scare away competitors.
Mm,
Um, and the reference case for that, I think, is most commonly Uber versus Lyft or Uber versus anyone who didn't it didn't continue. I'm not sure that there's a good universe of examples to say that this is the way that you win in tech. So, great. If you can pull it off and you can get LPs and you can raise billions of dollars as a fund, awesome. I'm not sure that every founder wants to make that bet. And I'm quite suspicious of the founders that are like heavily betting that that's the right, I think great. If you can go get the valuation, sell some secondaries and retire, awesome. I don't know that a lot of those companies are going to be around in 5 years. So there's a
you're talking
little bit
about
of,
the companies. You're talking about the companies that are anointed by the large VCs. You're not
yeah,
sure that they'll be around. Oh, okay. I see. I
yeah.
was going to ask you that because I'm no VC, but I can. I was wondering if that's even like a viable strategy as a VC. Though, it's like if you scare away competition in some ways, doesn't that also just prevent your startups from working as hard?
I mean, there's a bunch of yeah. The dynamics are going to be interesting, but I think the idea that you can buy a win, I don't know what percent of time it's going to work, right? But
I
my
see.
guess is it's a minority of times. So there's still plenty of room to do other things. The challenge is that I think the way that VC behaves, right? So if you think about, I think maybe the best description of this is if you think about most VC careers, if I'm a sort of mid or junior person, would I rather do the high risk thing that has a payoff in potentially 8 to 10 years, maybe longer? Can be a really long time to know the result. Or is it easier to get into the sort of popular deals with other known investors? Because if my goal is to go somewhere and get hired in a couple of years, my resume with a bunch of logos that people recognize is stronger than my resume of like, maybe this is a thing that will work, but it's too early to tell. And so that's creating a bunch of odd behavior. Anyway, but that's how venture is. It's very much in the don't hate the player, hate the game kind of thing. And I think our response to hating the game is to say like, there's a different way to play. It means we're
Yeah.
playing with different types of founders, right? Like this is not the thing that all founders want to do. It's also not clear how many VCs want to do this. That
Hmm.
remains to be seen. And so that's I think that's the biggest thing is sort of the VC dynamic. I think the other thing is there are founders who have been around enough and talked to other founders where you take $1 billion exit that is supposed to have been good for everyone, and the team and the founders haven't done that well. In some cases, the team got
Hmm.
zero. And so I think there's now a lot of evidence that there are supposedly great or good financial outcomes where the common stock has not done well. And the reason for that is the sort of obsession with raising, pre-seed, seed extension, A, B, C, D. You get 6 or 7 rounds in. Like cap tables weren't meant to work this way. Like cap tables support a few rounds historically before the numbers get too small and you have to start playing. You have to start engineering them in a way to make sure everyone gets paid. So there are more founders who recognize that and they're like, okay, well, how do I play the game a bit differently so that I'm not doing 7 or 8 rounds of dilution? Then there's another whole area, which is private credit, which even going back a few years was not that significant. So I don't mean like venture debt, which has been growing with venture investing. I mean all the other types of debt. So maybe my favorite example of this is when JP Morgan announced their sort of $1 trillion industrial, you know, funding, it's sort of reshoring, industrialization, commitment. I think this was a little bit more than a month ago. The number that they quoted was over $1 trillion, of which 10 billion of a trillion plus was equity. So it's all that other stuff, whatever non-equity there is, project finance, asset finance, whatever. There's a lot of that. Most VCs have never had to worry about what that is. Most founders have never had to worry about what that is. But there is a lot of it. The only requirement to access it is you better have revenue,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
then the options start to, whether it's working capital or factoring or revenue-based finance, whatever it is, there's probably 20 different products, but none of them involve dilution. And they're also different
Mm.
players, right? So some are banks, but very often it's private credit funds. There's a lot more of those around. So yeah, private credit is an interesting part in all the available private credit components. So all this to say, like, there's enough things that have changed in the background that it suggests to us that we should at least ask slightly different questions. And I think what we found is we like the answer. It turns out that, yeah, you can get to revenue faster and you can get to break even if you need to. And you can make Series A as a destination primarily about trying to get to like default to live or break even, less about a sort of unknown set of criteria that you may not be able to raise against, and then you sort of risk the company to get them.
All right, CleanTech founders, let's be honest. You need to move fast. It's 2026 and you cannot hesitate. You can't have things dragging you down or slowing you down. So why are you putting off the most critical thing that you can do to help you grow? And that is hire the best talent. We've heard it time and time again on this podcast. The best talent is what helps you grow. The new year is here, and every week that you miss out on hiring that head of sales, that mechanical engineer that you've been looking for some time, you are letting somebody else eat your lunch. It is 2026, and for CleanTech startups, it is currently survival of the fittest. You need the best people, and you need them now so that you can grow your company to where you need to get to your next fundraising round. And you need a recruitment partner who's going to match your energy and not going to slow you down. That's me and my firm, Earth Search. We work as an integrated recruitment partner only with CleanTech companies to hire their US talent, and we can help you with engineers, sales, co-founders, anything that you need, any talent in the US. We know your industry, we know your targets, and we can deliver. If you've been listening for some time, you know that for 5 years now, we have been having conversations with the leading CleanTech entrepreneurs in this past decade. We, as a result of this podcast, have been able to get into rooms that other CleanTech recruiters have never entered. And our network isn't just a bunch of resumes. Because of this podcast and these relationships, we know the people who have been the movers and shakers to actually build the most successful CleanTech companies in the past decade. You will not find more value in another recruitment partner. That we are confident of. We deliver proven talent faster and cheaper than traditional search firms. And just for you guys, for listeners of this podcast, until the end of January, we are running a promotion to kickstart your hiring in 2026. If you commit to 3 or more searches before February 1st, 2026, you will get $5,000 off your first search with us. That is in addition to the already massively discounted services that we offer on a regular basis. And don't wait, because we are only offering this to 3 companies. So if you'd like to get the conversation started, reach out to me directly on LinkedIn or email me at silas@earthsearch.com. That's ERTH search.com. Again, Earth with no A, ERTH search.com. And we'll get the conversation started. Again, we're only offering this to 3 companies because they only have so much bandwidth. We look forward to working with you to build a team of A players. Yeah, interesting. So that the core things, I'll just recap those ones, is the VC landscape itself changing to a consensus-based idea. So it's like, if you're not an AI first company, it's going to be different for you for raising, right? The broken cap tables piece, which is not, the outcomes being really undesirable at some point because you've raised so many extensions, et cetera. And then the private credit being an opportunity, meaning no dilution, right? So these things are changing the potential of how to play the game, right? And are there any other core things that you would add to that?
I mean, I think the other core thing, I don't know that we have enough great examples, but we certainly have a few of using AI to be more productive. Right. So, I mean, I think some of the obvious areas at this point in coding, right, it's not unusual to see teams that are making a lot of progress. So, like, that's a software thing. There are hardware teams where, firmware production is a little bit easier. Hardware like electrical and mechanical design are relatively less affected, but there are effects. But where it's really interesting is, I mean, we have been playing around with customer discovery using synthetic customers.
Interesting.
So if you think about customer discovery being this key, like, are you making something that people will pay for? If that's a key risk point, it turns out that, like, we may be able to make synthetic customers that you can interview before you actually go and talk to real customers. So you could have a really good idea what people think and what they're going to do before you ever talk to a human.
How is that done, though? Does that have to be done by each team, or are you saying that there's companies building these kind of data sets that you can then utilize?
So there are companies that have built synthetic sort of customer populations that you can interview, and then you can use LLMs to do, like, we've done a really sort of simplistic version of this, but like even looking at some of the recent deals we've reviewed, sort of validation of customer interests, is just interviewing, you know, here's a bunch of profiles. You said you think it's like homeowners living in this region. Okay, what do those people think? Well, there's decent profiles. Now, is it 95%? There's some research that says, yeah, you can get to 95%, but I would take even 60, 70% just to get directional. Like, are we even in the right direction? Like,
Yeah.
you don't need super high accuracy.
I mean, that could hypothetically cut down massive amounts of time spent just finding people to talk to and getting them on the phone.
Yeah. Or like doing that before you get people on the phone. So basically burning through, like,
I see.
in some
The dumb
cases, your
questions.
network or your access to people is going to be somewhat limited. So why burn through that before you know who you want to talk to and what you want to talk to them about? It's like,
Yeah, because it's also resource constrained. Do you think on the hardware side of things that we're going to see over the coming years tools that will also, like the same way that software engineering has become a lot faster, will apply to most of hardware engineering?
it's just different, right? So like, we work with Cove Tool, and it's interesting to look at their stack for like a physical world. They have a geometric drawing system platform, and then they have a physics for energy modeling. So when they create geometry and they make assumptions about material, you can change the material properties, but you have essentially a physics model. Don't do physics models. I mean, they can interact with physics models. So you could have a prompt to make a physics model do certain things and then get the result of the physics model and then decide to do something. But you need those models, right? Whether you want to call it a digital twin or you want to call it something else, you need something that's going to reproduce reality in software so you can try stuff. And then the try stuff part also looks different. You've got things like genetic algorithms where you can go and say, I want to try a whole universe of different variables. I'm going to basically build a population of solutions and see which ones do better. Again, not LLMs, it's a different architecture. So that stuff is happening. It's happening, but it's sort of, I think it's still a little bit outside of what's happening in the world. Like, a lot of money is still going into large language models and all of the infra for that. But we're starting to see, like, even something like we invested in Rainco. Rainco is about making physics models for fluids. You can try and do that with the LLMs. I'm willing to bet that's just not going to work. It's not what LLMs are meant for. So maybe you can find a research paper which summarizes a set of tests that were done in a wind tunnel, and you can approximate some stuff. But like actually reproducing the wind tunnel, so I can take something in software, put it in a wind tunnel in software, and get results in near real time. That's interesting, but it's quite far behind where, in terms of like platforms that are ready to be used, it's probably still a few years out.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense because it seems like in a lot of cases, it would have to be all very use case specific and the build out. Like it's not something you could just like plug in a whole bunch of data and get it to reproduce these things. You'd have to
one way to
probably.
think about this is, I didn't realize, I literally found this out in maybe a few weeks ago. There was an interview with Jensen about what they were doing with their sort of last money. They had to make some decisions before they were going to run out of cash. And they had a design, and the normal process for their chip design would have been, you go to TMSC, give them the chip, they do a sort of test run, you get the chip back, you do the test to make sure it does all the things you expect, and maybe you go back and forth a few times. That back and forth is expensive, right? Because it's physical things. Like there's a physical thing that gets produced. It has to get shipped somewhere. Someone has to test the physical thing, come up with a new design, et cetera, et cetera. That loop in the real world is expensive. So what they realized is they found a company that was making an emulator that had actually already failed. So this company saw the opportunity to design and test chips in software, but they were too early and went out of business. But they got a hold of the software. They basically built and tested their chips in their software, and they went straight to production with TMSC, which was considered a massive risk because at that point everyone was like, go and do a test, refine, iterate, etc., and then go into production. But that's literally the reason why NVIDIA is alive, is they skipped the back and forth in the physical world and they did the build and test in software. And so if you think about that, like we can do it for chips, but we're getting to the point where we should be able to do that for most things. And the more we can do things in software, the more we can use AI to speed up the design of physical things. right? I mean, same thing with robotics, right? Like robotics, people are like, how did robots get so good? Well, we've been able to train robots in a simulated environment. So the training robots part was it's done. The same thing with self-driving cars. Like you can build the universe of options. In most of the cases now, it's the hardware that had to catch up, right? So if the response time of a motor or an actuator in a leg for a humanoid robot was a little bit too slow, you knew what the answer was in the simulation, but you need a little bit more time for the motor to catch up. Anyway, so it's super interesting, but that's one of the reasons it feels like things are jumping in the physical world is it's because we can do things in a digital twin, so you don't see all the training.
Yeah, it makes sense. That's quite interesting. I feel like there's definitely an opportunity there for somebody to try to build the picks and shovels aspect of that because there's so much hardware interest right now in building hardware right now.
Yeah,
Broadly,
they are. Like there are folks like there's. We just we think of them like computer aided design is sort of evolving to maybe a better way to think of it is like digital twin, right? So some of the folks coming out of, let's say, Unity, coming out of game design, having realistic physics is useful, right? Because I can do things in Unity that are things that I could do in the real world, but I can obviously do it faster and almost free. So that stuff is happening. I think it's just like, how do you connect these things together so that it's automated, right? So that you can give AI some conditions to go off and look for solutions and sort of come back when it's found something. And that's already happening in software, but it's still, I think, a little bit behind in the hardware world.
yeah, that's quite fascinating. I appreciate that perspective. So I just want to maybe recap this then. So it seems like if you add, make sure I got this correct, but if somebody wants to follow this playbook of speed strapping, the core things are probably number one, start from day one with the mentality that you're going to try to get to revenue as quickly as possible. Part of that means in customer discovery, asking for a sale or asking for some sort of commitment, at least finding out if there's a true need and if there is a willingness to pay. And in some cases, maybe even taking orders before you have it, right? Like getting some deposits, right?
Yep.
Beyond that, also considering using off-the-shelf components whenever possible, just to get products out the door so you can shorten that time. Considering, I guess you'd say I shouldn't say alternative financing options. They're not necessarily that alternative, but thinking about in mind, like how can I get to a point where I no longer need to raise equity? I can actually just raise debt, for example, which will not dilute me. It will allow me to recruit better team members because there will be equity on the table. The cap tables aren't going to be broken. And then I don't know exactly how I would put this in there, but just generally speaking, faster using what existing AI tools there are to iterate and get through the process faster. I think those are the core things you mentioned. Is that correct? Did I miss anything?
Yeah, that's
okay.
It's that simple.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, a lot of these things are simple. It just requires you have to think through them, right? And I think that you guys do always a really good job of this, which is why I like talking to you, because
but I think
thinking through,
you hit it on the head at the beginning, right? Which is, we have seen some folks pivot when they run out of options, but it's much easier to sort of build your company with this in mind. And I think the other important thing that we didn't say is you're not giving up from an optionality perspective. You can still go and raise a Series A if you want and it works out. But you've sort of flipped the optionality. If you're aggressively trying to hit growth metrics and burning cash to get there, you've put your company at risk. And in many ways, from our perspective, for no reason. And even more, I think, from a climate perspective, like, why would we accept that failure mode? We don't need to. Like, why are you chasing a sort of unknown goal when there is, in some ways, an easier goal, which is focus on your customers, focus on shipping a product, and get to break even? Like, for us, increasingly, that, as hard as that is, that looks like an easier goal than trying to figure out, like, what exactly are people looking for? Well, it's easy to say. They can say 6x top line growth. Okay. So literally, it's like, that is a small universe of AI companies. And yeah, don't get me started on like whether that's sustainable, because I think a bunch of the 6x growth companies, no, they don't even have a moat, right? Like, I just think, like, in a very simple way, my own usage, like if you took the tools that you were using 18 months ago and think about how easily you swapped out tools, is there anything that you had a hard time swapping out? Probably not.
So far, no, not really.
So I'm like,
yeah, man. So I want to ask you. We don't have tons of time today, and there's a lot of topics we had planned. But let me ask you this. So there's two things I really would like to get your take on. And a while back, we talked about national security as kind of a core thing that you believe will drive more climate investing, whether it's done intentionally or I guess you say inadvertently through the government. And I'm just curious how you see this playing out right now. And I could reference a few of my friends who are building technology that kind of straddles between clean tech and defense. But I'm just curious what you're seeing this year specifically around that trend of national security and climate tech investing kind
Yeah.
of being intertwined.
So yeah, I should point out that I think there are a bunch of things, but given how we invest, I would say we think they are expensive for us, for our fund. Doesn't mean they're not going to be
Mhm.
great. Doesn't mean people aren't going to make money. Doesn't mean they won't be good for the U.S. So for sure, there are a bunch of good examples. I mean, I think there are changes in places like Japan. There are changes in places like Europe, where folks are asking serious questions about can we rely on China as part of the supply chain? And I think the conclusion is we probably shouldn't, not entirely anyway. And so there are folks benefiting from that. Some of that is on the electricity generation side. So we probably wouldn't have geothermal. We probably wouldn't have nuclear if it wasn't for national interest at this point. At least not the level of investment we're seeing. I
Because
think
they want to not be dependent on Chinese solar panels, correct?
yeah, I think it's like solar and batteries on an economic basis should own everything
Yeah,
in most places. So if you go to places where there's sort of just, let's say, unregulated, unsubsidized, that's what wins mostly.
yeah, yeah,
Um, so there's definitely on the power side, the fact that it's connected to AI is great. I think the pure defense is tricky. I think Palaki probably has the best take on this, which is, people forget that the last time the US had to scale up defense production, it was doing automotive production. So we reused the industrial base from essentially consumer products to be able to ramp defense. And I'm not sure that's exactly what's happening. I think there's a bunch of interesting defense investing going on, but I don't know that it's able to rely on. I mean, it's a little bit like the, use off the shelf Legos. It makes a difference if there's 1,000 of those Legos or 100 million of them, right? The ones being produced at the scale of 100 million are what we would want if we're going to produce anything at scale. So I think it's mixed on reshoring. Like, I think there are some things that are interesting, but it's a little bit early to tell. Like, I don't know what's going to happen with batteries in the US. It's a little bit all over the map. And then, resilience and adaptation, I think one of the struggles is probably cost basis. So like generally the DoD is paying more, even if they are paying less and looking for more dual use. If your first use case is military, generally you're designing a more expensive thing. And so some of the crossover is unclear. We have plenty of companies that are starting with commercial first and then going to DoD. That seems to work. But there definitely is more and more crossover, right? Like we have probably if we went back 5 years, maybe we had single-digit % companies that would sell to the Defense Department. That's easily getting up to 20 or maybe 30% that could. And so, yeah, it's, you have another great customer. So, some areas very clear. It's not areas we are investing heavily, but in some areas it's still mixed.
yeah. I think it's fascinating that the market share piece is interesting. So I was just a couple weeks ago. I mean, this will come out much later, but recently I was at the Hack Summit in New York, and one of my friends, Will O'Brien from Ulysses. I don't know if you're familiar with that company, but he was explaining that they originally started focusing on underwater like adaptation things, like restoring seagrass things under the ocean, right? So they're building underwater autonomous drones, and the market share though is just like substantially smaller than I think if I remember correctly the numbers, it was like something like of their possible TAM between commercial defense and restoration or ecological reasons, the ecological aspect only took up like 10% of the TAM. So it's so small in comparison. So they're focusing on obviously the kind of pivoting to largely focus on commercial and government use cases. But that can eventually bring down the cost of the drones as a whole, which can then be used for doing the ecological restoration work. So again, I think there's this tension because depending on what kind of investor you are, a lot of climate investors, they don't really want to have anything to do with defense. But I'm just curious from your perspective, do you think that there has to be some sort of like reckoning with the decision of, hey, we need to find ways to invest in technologies that will be able to achieve these things from a climate perspective. But in order to do so, there's going to be some other involvement. The technology is going to be a platform for more than one thing, because just simply speaking, the TAM is not there otherwise.
Yeah, look, I think in a perfect world, what you would do is you would say, I mean, there are examples of this, right? Like there are smartphone applications that got deployed into communities that we would regard as poor in, different parts of the world, and that the company, the products were designed for that community first. They were the primary beneficiaries in terms of like being able to do banking transactions, etc. So there are examples of places where technology goes directly to the people who need and benefit most, probably from an impact perspective. But that's really unusual. And it's even more unusual for hardware, right? Like generally hardware, when we're talking about things like prepayments, whether or not, you need folks with budgets. And very often those are not the folks that impact investors are thinking about. In fact, there may be folks that impact investors generally don't like. And yeah, we can say defense, but you could say also wealthy consumers, right? Like a lot of the stuff that we're talking about starts off as a toy. Again, like not to beat the Tesla example, but to get to a low cost autonomous fleet, like if you sat down and said like, what's the best way to get to low cost per mile, fully electric, without a driver? It would have really bothered people, a lot of impact investors, to say, oh, I think the answer is let's start with a sports car for wealthy people. But that's literally what was required.
I mean, this is not just what's required in Tesla's case. So, like, this is usually the case for startups. It's like always find a beach, even with software, right? You find a beachhead market, you find like a particular way to enter it, and then obviously you improve, and eventually, especially with hardware, you bring the cost down, and then it can become available to other people. I find it challenging though, because if you're, again, I'm not in an investor's seat, but if I'm trying to invest in these technologies, you and I both know that startups pivot a lot throughout the journey. So what do they do when they come to you and say, hey, listen, we're building a defense tech here, and down the road we want to do impact we want to do impact things too? You're gonna be like, sure, cool, like we'll do that, or you're gonna say, nah, it's just not in our remit. Like, I don't know how that's going to square out, and how the best opportunities are going to actually be able to be accessed by the clean tech investors.
Yeah, it's not easy. I think early on when we are talking with folks, we do have customer discussions. Again, just coming back to if you get to revenue fast, you sort of like, if I was going to go on sort of development, timeline of 5 years, I think you're right. There's a risk that somewhere along the 5 years, someone comes to me and says, hey, this looks super interesting. Why don't you come and talk to, Navy, or, someone in defense. I'm not calling it Department of War yet. We'll just keep calling it defense. But that goes, the likelihood goes up if I'm on like a 5 year before I can get to revenue. If I'm in my first sort of 12 months of trying to do customer discovery and I found a bunch of buyers, I think we feel pretty good about saying, okay, we know who that is. If you came back a few years later and said, actually, there's a huge opportunity for us to double the TAM by selling into defense applications, we'd want to have a conversation about it. But I think like, the idea that there's sort of a no-go because it's defense, I don't know. I mean, certainly for us, like post-Ukraine, I don't think it's as big as an issue. So I think the way that we have one large LP that asks us to do extra review when there is defense, just to make sure we're not going like totally out of the lines.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the time the concern there is not defense. The concern there is, I think the background is which country are we talking, like which country is fine.
Yeah. I mean, it's very challenging, because it's like this also then it goes in a lot of ways, I think, against the grain of many people in climate. Again, I am generalizing here, but I feel pretty safe doing this. So that generally speaking, a lot of people in climate would probably fall into more of the globalist camp. They're like, hey, we want to save the earth. Like, we don't care who, we want everybody to collaborate. But then you have to kind of, in order to build these technologies, like you have to combat like, hey, is it going to be us or is it going to be China building, right? One of my other friends, Augustus Dorico, building Rainmaker, right? Like cloud seeding. China is like super good at this. I think, I believe in the Middle East is getting pretty good at this too. So it's kind of like, it's him in the US versus the entire government of China, like really investing in these programs. And he's doing it from a national security perspective. He wants to see the US succeed at this. He wants the US to be able to have the ability to control the weather too, unlike, just having China do it. And I think this is something that is, I don't want to necessarily go in and try to make a proclamation here, but we have to think about these things and square the ideas of, what is our core loyalty here? How do we
Yeah.
structure these things as we go about investing? Like, are we going to do this for the sake of America plus the climate, or are we doing this like in reverse order? Like, you have to figure that out and decide what your camp's going to be in. It's okay to have a decision, but you have to pick one, and you can't just say, at least I personally believe that you can't just say, hey, we want to solve climate change, even if that means just like China gets all the technology and we're going to be fine that way. I personally, would say I'm not okay with that. I think there's others who are much less worried about the China situation personally, from what I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think the difficult thing here is, what is, there's a question about what is reality. So if you replay the last 20 years of US foreign policy, Republicans tend to have done a better job, right? And part of the reason is they can call out things that they think are more representative of human behavior over time. The Democratic position has been, I think, more wishful thinking. It's the world that I would like to live in, but it's not reality when your counterparties are Xi Jinping and Putin. And so you kind of have to make a choice about what is actually happening versus what the world that you want to live in. And I think that's the tension. And I use foreign policy. We can go through other policies, but like that to me is the easiest one, right? Is there was a moment when it looked like engaging with China was going to have certain payoffs. And the payoff for at least from the US perspective was you get a bunch of economic benefits and maybe you get democracy and you get a friendly superpower. And I think the consensus more and more is like, no, that's probably not what the current government in China wants. Like forget about what individual people are. Like you can put me in most places in the world. People have more in common with each other. At this point, we're talking about community. And so, and this is a change in China. I think like you would have to say we have to embrace reality, and we are sort of fighting for who determines, what are the norms in the world for our kids, for a few generations into the future. So from that perspective, for folks that are like aggressively arguing in the current administration in tech to be aligned with the current administration, I think that's reality. It's not what I like. And I think unfortunately, a lot of folks in climate who got into climate, when you sort of describe the world that you want, you're not going to get very much pushback. You want things to be cheap and nearly free for everyone. You want abundance for everyone. Like these are not things, you don't want people to suffer necessarily. Like all of those things are desirable goals. The difference now is sort of how do you get there? The game is different if everyone's on board and you go to COP, everyone signs off and says, oh, I'm going to fund carbon removal at this level for 20 years and we'll be done. Like that just was never happening.
Yeah. Wishful thinking is the right thing. Again, this is where it's such a struggle. It's like, do you as an investor want to invest in the optimistic world that you want to see, or like also play by the rules of what's going on right now? So one last thing I would really like to try to touch on before we run out of time is I've been trying to figure out, we hosted an event during Climate Week called How to Win in the Anti-Climate Era. And my primary objective with that was try to figure out if there's going to be a specific branding or titling or way that climate or clean tech companies, again, they may not be called that anymore, what they're going to look like going forward. And I'm just curious if you have any particular takes on this, where you think that in the next, let's say, 3 to 6 years, give or take, like, do you think that the branding or the way that clean tech companies are going to position themselves, is that going to be a certain way? Is it going to vary a lot depending on what you're building? Like, what is your general perspective on that? Because this is something I've been trying to rack my brain around and figure out for months now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've believed for a long time that the best climate companies are just great companies that happen to also be good for the planet. And it's our sort of dumb luck at this point that the tech stack for building things, especially in the hardware world, is getting better for the planet, right? So like just at a simple level, like electric things have a bunch of advantages over internal combustion things. They're just lucky at this point. But it does mean that more things will get built with electric things, right? The electrified stack is going to win. And that's great. So I think like from that perspective, in a lot of the sort of climate pathways in terms of emissions, at this point, like, I think it's sort of post, we don't need to really talk about it. We just need to figure out, like, what are the things that will bring the electrified stack faster? And a lot of the time, like, it's just destined to win at this point. Like, there may be some subsidies and there may be some bumps in the road, but like, so that's that. I think in the last few, like, we just invested in a company that we haven't announced. So I'll just say it's a materials company. They recycle nylon. From their end customer perspective, they just look like a better, cheaper, stretchy fabric made out of nylon, right?
So, but I mean, this is the whole point. Is like,
I can give you the LCA that tells you it's fucking amazing
it's
for
better.
the climate.
Yeah.
But first and foremost, the economics are great.
This is what I wonder though, always from an ecosystem perspective, because it's very easy to say right now, oh, I'm building an AI, but like we're talking about, there's multiple, I guess you'd say, stakeholders that could use the product or whatnot. And I think in a lot of cases, most of the best clean tech companies will have, like, it's just going to be simply a better product that is cheaper. And yes, you can apply that to the climate problem. But in reality, it's like that's like not necessarily what they're solving for per se. It just is a kind of co-benefit that is great to see.
The thing about this is the climate benefits are on the about page and the customer benefits on the homepage, right? So like when you think about like how do you want your company to show up in the world and what are the benefits you want, that's a company stakeholder discussion. It's not top of mind necessarily for your end customer. And I think for the best companies, it's not. Your end customers should behave selfishly, pick the thing that's better, faster, cheaper, classic tech adoption. Doesn't matter if it's Department of Defense, doesn't matter if it's Fortune 500, doesn't matter if it's a consumer. Self-interest, I don't want to give the Wall Street speech about greed is good, but like the self-interest piece that drives, like I think the mistake that people make very often in climate is you forget that in the end, the system is customers making decisions to buy things. That's the base operating layer for whatever we're talking about. We are asking customers to buy things and adopt it quickly so we get a result. And we shouldn't confuse that with the fact that, yes, there's important policy work that could help that go faster by subsidizing some things or not subsidizing other things. But it is still just that. We need people to buy different things that incrementally are better for the planet.
Yeah.
I think when people lose sight of that, and it's just like, you should buy this because it's the right thing to do. We made that mistake for a while, right?
Yeah, I know. It wasn't necessarily working, right? Like we're seeing those companies that were just focused on that only, that kind of like shrug their shoulders, say like nobody wants to buy it, right? It's like no wonder, because you're not saving anybody a lot of money. You're not doing something that's just like substantially better in product. You just expected that, hey, because we had the Paris Climate Accords, that everybody was just suddenly going to be on board with this. And I think that was true in certain niches, but it wasn't true of the general population.
I think it was very true for a lot of people. I really do. I think the challenge is, and this, again, we can keep coming back to customer discovery is the hard thing. Because if you went out and asked Fortune 500 companies what their objectives were, they were pretty clear. There were shareholder meetings, there were analyst calls. Like the signal was pretty strong. And I think the intent was there. But I think the reality is, like, even looking at the US economy today, like outside of Mag 7, life is not easy. The idea that you have a discretionary budget that just lets you do the right thing, turns out it's not really there. And that's true for most consumers. You can go around the world, people aren't asking to spend more money. Do I think that they would like to if they could? Yes, but they cannot.
Yeah.
So I think that's the hardest part in climate by far, is like, it's a little bit like is this the world you would like to live in? Absolutely. As a practical matter, do you have enough money to fund it? No.
So when you then are looking at a lot of companies, in many cases, do they just appear to be like robotics companies, technology companies, like materials companies? They just appear to be that, and then it's like, oh, when you look a little closer, you see that it's a clean tech company, like, or it applies to the clean tech lens.
Yeah. So if we think about our like deal memo at this point, like the way that we think about impact is you have to go through market sizing and you have to go through rate of adoption to drive the impact model. In other words, I can't claim to reduce emissions unless I have the revenue growth to show that there's adoption. Yeah. So I think for a while we would say, here's the impact we want to underwrite for. Let's see if the other stuff works. Now it's sort of like, assuming this actually grows at the rate that we would like, and the market is as big as we believe it is, this is what the impact should be. So the impact is it's sort of the exhaust of the process if we got everything else right. And I think that's actually for us in many ways, it's an easier way to look at it. Like I think we would be doing, probably this year we would have done the largest number of investments ever. The only reason we didn't is like from a fund size and pricing perspective, we set out a lot of AI and robotics deals. We think they can be impactful, but just the fund math for us doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So let me ask you one last thing then, and we can wrap it up here. Is if this is all the case, does this have to change in any way substantially the way you market yourself as a fund to attract those builders?
I think so. I mean, look, part of the speed strapping discussion has been interesting, and we will almost certainly write a book next year. Like we have all the pieces of it. And that may be the main reason that people want to work with us. And that, again, is sort of like in our reason for existing, right? The about page is still going to be about climate. Having more shots on goal because they're more viable companies that get to scale in hardware, that's a requirement to have more impact. So that will be the story that we want people to know about. That's the reason hopefully people want to work with us. It's not because we know more sustainability departments. It's not because we can get more offtake agreements done for green cement. It's not because we know policymakers in the US and Europe, like other people can do those things. But we think the most important thing is if we want to double the number of companies that can scale hardware, that at scale will have a positive impact on the climate, the answer is day one, you need to be thinking about how you scale. And if that requires that you try and achieve some weird set of goals at Series A, no one's getting any impact because those companies probably aren't going to survive. So why are we wasting everyone's time?
Yeah, I mean, it's also like, I mean, you kind of alluded to this, but if the founders and the team can actually keep a lot more equity too, of course they're going to work with you, right? Of course they're going to want to like try to go through your avenues and follow your playbook, right?
I mean, people
so
have
this
to
is a
believe
nice
that it's doable, right? They're choosing between like, it's really hard to look at Andreessen, to look at, GC, some of the large multi-billion-dollar platforms and say, these guys are wrong. I don't think that they are wrong. But they are going to be right for a relatively small slice of venture-backed companies. And I think we have a lot of case studies to suggest that the path to sort of $1 billion company in climate with significant impact doesn't always require Series A. Certainly not in the way that we've always done it.
Yeah. Interesting, man. Well, this is really fascinating. We're out of time today. Again, we'll have to have you on a fifth time. There's no shortage of things I could ask you, but no, this was really good. I appreciate you sharing this. Do you guys have any content posted about this aside from here? Have you written about this yet? And I can link that
share
to anybody.
Yeah, we've got 2 Substack. It's just called Speed Strapping. There's like 2 of them, and it's kind of like our first playbook, which was the thing that we shared with founders in our portfolio to say, I think we've done 4 of these. This is like the 4th version of our fundraise playbook. And I think it just accidentally, we looked at it and said, actually, we've changed at the Series A, we've sort of flipped the goal, right? Where break even is first and it used to be the backup plan. So
cool. Awesome, Shaun. Well, it's always a pleasure chatting with you. I always learn quite a lot, so I appreciate you taking the time.
Just in time, animals here, the dog and the cat just
exactly. Exactly. Keep that cat safe from the Waymos, all right? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, it's good to have you on again.
Good to see you.
All right, everybody. That's it for today. If you found value in this, please share this episode with at least one other person who would like it. This is the best way for us to grow, is through your sharing. Finally, if you would like help winning grant funding, reach out to our sponsor, Climate Finance Solutions. You can do that at climatefinancesolutions.com. And if you want to build a truly differentiated talent attraction system, one that'll give you an advantage over your competitors, an unfair advantage, I might say, reach out to me and my team. You can do that on LinkedIn or reach out to me directly. Silas@earthsearch.com. Again, that's Earth with no A. We had to find a way to get the domain. And if you did catch it during the episode, we are running a promotion for January. So if you'd like to get $5,000 off your first search, reach out to my team and we will get that started. Find out more in the description. All right. Thank you guys so much for listening. See you next time on Clean Techies.